Today is Wednesday, August 2nd, the year 2006. My name is Sharon Alterman, and I'm here with Mr. William Davidson at the Guardian Industries building, and we are conducting an oral history interview. Mr. Davidson, do we have your permission to use the contents of this interview for the historic record?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, we had the pleasure of meeting 2 years ago, and we spoke at that time about your family history, your formative years, your involvement in this community and in philanthropy. But we didn't speak that much about your mother. And I understand in the intervening 2 years, there's some information that has come into your possession that you'd like to share with us, primarily about your mother's role in Hadassah.
Yes.
What are your recollections?
Well, I recently found a letter from Henrietta Zold to my mother. It was a lengthy 2.5 page letter. It was written in the summer of 1917. At that time, my mother would have been single. It was written to Sal Wetzman. She would have been 26 years old. The letter described the formation of Hadassah, which took place at my grandmother and grandfather's house on 90 Virginia Park, where Henrietta Zold stayed apparently for about 3 days. And the letter described how much she enjoyed the visit, how much she enjoyed the Yiddishkeit of the house, and that she was so pleased with the formation of the new chapter. She then left for Youngstown, Ohio, where apparently there was already an established chapter. I would guess that my mother's two sisters, Fan Salson and Mary Wetzman, who were roughly 2 years younger each, one 2 and then another 2, would have been at the meeting, but I'm not sure of that. I'm almost sure that Fan was, because my Aunt Mary did go to law school in Chicago, where she was actually a very close friend and classmate of Susan Brandeis, who was Brandeis's daughter. Yes, and they were good friends for quite a few years because of that connection. At the same time, there were other 2 members of the family. My older uncle, Barney Wetzman, who was the oldest of the children, probably lived partially in the house, but also did live partially out because he was already fairly heavily engaged in business, whereas the younger uncle, who was Frank Wetzman, was in the Navy at that time, 1917 being World War I.
So your mother was an ardent Zionist right from her earliest years.
Yes. We also have, she was awarded a Sholem Award, whatever that was particularly at the time. And in that particular speech, she describes the fact that my grandfather attended the second Zionist convention at Balfour and took her and the other 2 daughters. So he took them to a number of Zionist, not only the Balfour things in Basel, Switzerland, but to various programs in the States, where she was fascinated by all of the Zionist speakers, and she always referred to Louis Lipsky, Rabbi Weiss, and there were a number of early Zionist speakers who had a great influence on her. Now, after the formation of Hadassah, she was always devoted to Hadassah through her whole life, and that was what she supported and did. I talked to, just as an aside, who's there?
Bob?
What?
Bob Aronson?
Yeah, Bob Aronson. I was telling Bob that I do recall because down through the years when she was very active, the most powerful woman in the community was Dora Ehrlich. And Dora kind of was a stalking thing for everybody. And they didn't have a disagreement. But when Federation was formed, my mother disagreed with Dora, and Dora felt that, the Federation, because she was also, Dora was friendly with Leo Butzel, that the Federation was a good thing. My mother didn't think it was such a good idea. So Dora did split her time between Hadassah and the Federation, and my mother didn't. That was in the late 30s.
And you also mentioned that your family traveled to Palestine early on.
Yes, in the 1930s. It was kind of interesting. We did, actually, John Aaron went to the village where my grandparents came from, particularly my grandfather, and because I don't think my grandmother came from that same little village. And it's a little bit, it's about 100 kilometers west of Kiev, and there are no Jews left there anymore. What really was unfortunate in our family was that my Aunt Mary corresponded with relatives and in the village, which are probably cousins, and they were relatively close relatives. And then as World War II started, because it was under communist Russian control at that time, the particular village, they asked, she used to write them fairly regular basis and send clothes, food, etc. And they said, don't correspond with us anymore. So we lost track of them, and then I think they were probably all killed, because when we finally went back, there was none there. However, in 1930, when my grandfather, father, and mother went to the village, they were there, and he describes how he told them how great America was, and that was the days of when they would almost think that the streets were paved with gold, and they were just fascinated by his presentation, and he loved, talking to them and telling them how great things were here. And then they went from there on to Israel, and they also had contact with a lot of the early Israeli pioneers, including some of the more radical ones, who were friends of, became family friends. And also, as I recall, there was an Irma Lindheim, who was a pioneer in terms of the kibbutz movement, who migrated to Israel. And then, of course, Golda Meir was a teacher, as we all know, in Milwaukee, and she was a friend of Dora Ehrlich's, because Dora was also a teacher. So my mother and Dora had contacts with Goldie Meyerson before she moved to Israel.
When was your first trip to Israel?
My first trip to Israel was in 1949. And I went with a cousin, Jonathan Orr, and we were able to see the refugee camps. They were spread across the beach at Tel Aviv, and then we visited kibbutzes, and all I remember at that time was all you had to eat was tomatoes and cucumbers. That was a diet wherever you went. But when you got the food at the Milchik kibbutz was great. There you got some real good food.
So you've really seen the growth of the country from
from the beginning.
Really early years.
And then I'd gone back probably for a long period of time, every 3-4 years. And then being into several businesses in Israel, over the last, I'd say, 15 to 20 years, I've been going almost yearly.
Really supporting the country in so many ways.
Yes, we of course have an interest in. We established the float glass plant there, Phoenicia, and then have a major interest in a company called Orbitec. So actually with David Hermelin, we did a lot of business in Israel over a period of 15 to 20 years with the various investments, and moved in, out. And the interesting part is that we always made money in Israel, and that wasn't necessarily the primary intention, but it worked that way. So Israel has been very good from a business point of view from the things that we invested in.
Is there anything else that you recollect about your mother that perhaps we didn't say on the first tape that you'd like to include here?
Yes. When I came across the papers, I found out that she was asked to be the founder of Women's for Bonds, and she accepted that job and kind of organized it, but then turned it over to Mina Bargeman, who became the first chairman, and then my mother was a co-chairman, but I think Mina did this more of the work than my mother at that particular time.
So she left us a beautiful legacy.
Yes, certainly, as did my grandparents. My grandfather was, and they probably arrived in Detroit because my mother graduated from high school in Iowa, Oskaloosa, Iowa, at the age of 15. What's kind of interesting, who knows what kind of a high school, it was, but we have our degree. And that was, she was born in 1890, and that was in 1905. So somewhere between 1905 and 1908 or 9, they probably arrived in Detroit. We do know that they stopped in Chicago because he decided that he had 3 girls and that they were going to find husbands in Iowa. So he decided to move to either Chicago or Detroit. Stopped in Chicago, decided he'd move on to Detroit, which he did. So the family must have arrived somewhere 7, 8, 9, something like that. And what's kind of interesting to me is I know that my mother went to Central High School, which was Wayne University, and probably for maybe a year. So she also got another degree from there. And when I went to Central, which was in 1938, I had 2 of the same teachers that she had, which
they were really
40, only about a 30-year span. So
they were
made sense. They probably
career teachers.
Yeah, they're probably early in their careers,
right, exactly.
and then later in their careers. But I told her the teachers I had that. So that was kind of interesting. I would say that's pretty much it. Like I say, my grandfather did take them to all kinds of Zionist meetings, and they thoroughly enjoyed all the great Zionist speakers of the time. Do you have the thing? We can mention,
Speech.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Then I can mention some of those speakers because she refers to them in her speech.
So she was an educated woman. Your mother was.
Oh yes, yes, they were. My aunt particularly. There's another story in that my Aunt Mary, who was the youngest, and she was a really brilliant. So she got a degree from the University of Chicago, law degree. And then when she came back, and my sister and I have a little disagreement as to the timing, but my grandfather decided, because my youngest Uncle Frank was a fun guy, and decided that he should become a lawyer, but he wouldn't go by himself. So she went back to Detroit College of Law with him
Oh my!
to
What
make
a
sure
story.
that he got a law degree, which he got and never used.
So she got a double degree.
Yeah, right. So she went back again. And in her speech, and I'll quote from it, we became familiar with the outstanding personalities in Europe as well as in this country in the Zionist movement. We heard Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, on numerous occasions. We were fascinated by talks by Dr. Shmira Levin and well informed by the talks of Louis Lipsky. In this country, we were inspired by Judge Louis Brandeis, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, and many others. I thought it'd be nice to mention those
Yes,
names.
definitely. That's part of the legacy.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. I'm glad we got a chance to speak again.
thank you.
I'd just like to add that Mother was the president of, eventually, of the Central States region of Hadassah.
Oh.
And she traveled around and made speeches. She was a wonderful extemporaneous speaker with a voice that had carried. Could hear her.
Yeah, she had a,
Wonderful, wonderful.
She was comfortable
Very
in
comfortable.
the public.
Very comfortable.
okay.
Anything else you'd like to say? We have the time, if you just have some family memories.
One of the reasons.
I'm now speaking with Dorothy Gerson. We're going to speak a little bit more about your family legacy. Well, there was a story you wanted to add to the discussion.
Well, I just wanted to add that my grandparents, both, my grandfather and my grandmother, were two of the strongest personalities I have ever met, and very different, but in their own way. If they were there, you knew they were there. And their 5 children turned out to be very much like that. Our oldest uncle was a born entrepreneur, as was our grandfather. And but he also liked to have fun. So he happened to have flunked out of the University of Michigan, where he was having such a good time. And that was one of the reasons that my grandfather made up his mind that the other son was going to be a lawyer. He was not even going to just have to be graduating, he was going to be a lawyer. And that's how Aunt Mary became one of the first female lawyers in the country. She had a photographic memory. She was brilliant, absolutely academically brilliant. She had gotten a teacher's degree. She got the degree from Troy College of Law. She got this scholarship or whatever it was to University of Chicago, where she was a star in the law school. And she became the head of the Legal Aid Bureau of Detroit.
Oh.
And our mother was this incredible speaker. I mean, she just got up and spoke. And our youngest uncle was the 2 brothers, the sons, were full of fun. They just, and which was our grandfather. He was one of the most fun guys you could ever imagine. He was always laughing, telling jokes, and that kind of person. And his 2 sons, well, especially the younger son, were so much like him. So, but they were not the perfect students. The 3 girls were marvelous students, and that's why Aunt Mary got her second degree and everything.
Whether she liked it.
Yeah, right.
You didn't name the sons. Would you mind just?
Yeah, the oldest was Barney Wetzman, and he was actually the one who Guardian Glass came from. This was one of his many things that he purchased when he was in his entrepreneurial days. He was basically a builder, and he actually, and my grandfather was not only in real estate but in theaters. And when the Avalon Theater was going to be built, my grandfather had as his builder Barney Wetzman, his son.
How nice.
And so that was that brother. And the youngest uncle was a partner of a very serious man. He was a fun guy himself. But they were a marvelous partnership, and they eventually owned lots of theaters and lots of everything, and were very entrepreneurial as well.
What was his name?
Frank Wetzman. That was Frank Wetzman. And he was also very active in his day in Federation wonderful man, wonderful. And I think that's about it.
Thank you. It sounds
would
like,
like to say.
your formative years were very interesting and
They were very interesting.
Yeah.
The
Memorable.
brothers and the sisters in that family, although they had lots of friends and lots of life outside of the family, loved to be with the family. I think almost would rather be with their family than with anyone. It was a very close family. And interesting because they were all such vibrant personalities, but they loved to be together. And
Being in that room was quite an experience.
Well, and it was a marvelous thing for the children because I'm the oldest and the only girl. Then came my brother and 4 more boys. And it was more like we were almost brothers, all of them, as far as I'm concerned. And so that was and we had, our mothers spent all their summers together, which was quite unusual. All the 3 sisters wanted to be together, so they had this cottage in Port Huron, where we all, the day after school, the cars were packed and up we went to Port Huron to spend the summers together. So it was all, it was all 3 sisters, but it was, the mothers were interchangeable, and I always felt, in some ways, I had 4 mothers, because there were 3 sisters and a sister-in-law, but they were very, very close, all of them. It was a very unusual, very loving, very caring family. And always their idea was to give back. They always, from a tiny little girl, Bill knows the first check I ever got in my life that was mine, my mother said, "Oh, that's just wonderful, because now we have this cousin we can give it to." I mean, there was the feeling of you had to take care of other people. It was a very strong feeling in that family.
Oh, those are the family values.
And I think my brother
that you live by.
Sure, I got that right there. So that would be what I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad we had the opportunity to meet with you today as well. Yeah.
They would come over on every Friday night. He would come over, and you would hear screams, yells. I mean, you can't imagine
what was going on.
I thought they were. Of course, I was used to it. Yeah. I thought they were killing each other.
It was just on clean fun, huh?
And it was the 2. My Aunt Mary was already gone, but the 2, Mother and he against Frank, and they would. Then all of a sudden there would be quiet, and they would have their coffee and their things, and they were loving again. And that was the greatest experience. I mean, they just loved it.
It was a tradition.
Right.
Something we could change.
I tell you, it was so funny.
Right.
Yeah, because he was always, trying to reestablish himself. I always disagree. Anything I said, they would fight. But then, and next Friday night.
So it didn't chase him away by any means.
They lived across the alley from each other. We lived in one house. My aunt lived across the street, and he lived behind us on Chicago Boulevard. He lived on Boston.
Yeah.
This is the good old days when family was so close.
So all I had to do was walk over.
Right.
Well, the interesting thing was that, this family were all born out in Iowa. Very often, as people stay longer in this country, they are less of that kind of family life.
That's right. They move all.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, born in Iowa, raised in Iowa, raised in cities where there were no other Jewish people, and always friendly with everybody in the town and everything, but they never lost their Jewishness, their feeling about being Jewish and it meaning so much to them. And they never lost their familial feelings at all. Not at all.
Your grandfather, he just
spoke
came.
perfect English. My grandfather when he came over, he couldn't speak a word of English.
They
And
learned.
by the time his English was perfect, he had never had an accent.
No. And our grandmother, when he was the kind of person, first of all, she was brilliant, absolutely, academically brilliant, but she had not. But because she knew every she was a great gardener, knew every flower in the garden, you drive by, she knew every plant. I mean, she had such knowledge of so many things. Then, of course, she was a vegetarian,
Huh?
our grandmother.
Is the tape running?
No,
Is-
no.
okay. But it's interesting to
No.
say. No, okay.
Yeah.
She became friendly with Dr. Kellogg, the
Oh.
brother of the Cornflakes King, who ran something called the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was completely vegetarian. This man was years ahead of his time. He was always sure that we're eating too much meat and this and that, and it's not good for you. So and my grandmother, I was the oldest and the only girl, so I spent a lot of time with her. So she used to take me to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which she loved.
Loved it.
And you could order, steak, lamb chops, this or that. Now it would come this plate. If it was lamb chops, something looking like a lamb chop, a vegetarian, completely vegetarian. And partially she must have loved it because she was kosher.
Yeah.
So she
that's
could
right,
eat
so that was
anything
easy for
there.
her.
The steak,
Sure.
the lamb chops, this or that. The other thing that was so amazing, and I don't know, did you know this? At the end, this man was so far ahead of his time. So we'd have this dinner, and then everyone got up, and they'd say, to the gym. We all went to the gym. And my grandmother led the line, walking around the gym, walking. It was the most amazing thing.
How old would she have been in those?
She would have been, her children were grown, and of course, her children were grown by the time she was 25, maybe.
Oh my. She had
So
very young.
she was 40, 50,
Oh, so she was young.
50,
Yeah,
60,
yeah.
right in there, right. And she believed in exercise, I can tell you. And she was always also into vitamins. I mean, she prescribed for everybody.
Did she live a long life?
92.
Oh,
For
so
those days.
that was a long
Well, it was
life.
amazing because
Yeah.
she had a stroke at 88 or 89, and they said 3 months. She can't live more. So 2 or 3 years later,
Still going.
yeah, right. Very commanding. I mean, just gave orders a lot.
Do you have a lot of photographs of your family?
Yes, I have wonderful photographs. Well, Bill had a book called The Wet Scenes.
Yes.
You've seen
yeah.
the book.
I've seen that
And
book.
most of those photographs I have. And the focus of the book was my mother and her 4 siblings.
I have to go back and look at it again.
Right.
The funny
Do you have any
story.
extra copies for the archives? Because I don't know if Bob has a copy.
The what copy?
Of the
book.
archives.
No, a book. I'd like to have a copy of the book of
One
the
of the books.
Yeah,
Westmans.
sure. I just asked Rosemary. She
Oh,
has
good,
it.
good. I will take it.
The funny thing was she lived with us. She was getting into her 90s by then, and she was treated by Dora Ehrlich's son-in-law.
Gingold. Sam
Gingold.
Gingold.
Yeah, it was, and I hear her in there yelling at him one day. You've been treating me for 10 years. I'm no better now today than I am when you started.
But you're still here.
She was yelling at
10
me.
years old.
What good have you ever done me?
There's a better one. There's a
Do you
better
have
one.
any answers?
Oh,
I
she
was
was-
yelling at her.
Oh, she
She
was
was-
a character. She got something wrong with her on her foot. And I had already gotten married and gone. She had got in my bedroom at Mother's house after I left. Anyway, so my grandmother's there. And they couldn't find any doctors that day, and she needed a doctor. Her foot was bothering her. So they got a hold of a dermatologist. I've forgotten his name. Anyway, so in comes this guy who was a very wonderful dermatologist. And he said, blah, 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 this and that, and my grandmother, and we could hear her. And she had a voice you could hear. He said, I'm a dermatologist, Mrs. Wetzman, and I don't really believe that I can treat what you have. You got going on. There's a long silence, and I hear this voice. Young man, did you go to medical school?